I knew the HOA was petty, but I never thought they'd stoop this low. I stood in my front yard, fists clenched, staring at the slab of fresh cement where my flower beds used to be. Just yesterday, my marigolds, roses, and hydrangeas were thriving years of care and patience growing them into a beautiful display. Now, a soulless gray slab of concrete mocking me under the afternoon sun. I turned to see her standing smugly on the sidewalk. Abigail Torrance, the HOA president, arms crossed over her obnoxiously bright pink blazer, lips twisted in that self-satisfied way that made my blood boil. "You violated HOA regulations," Abigail said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Your flower beds were not in line with community guidelines." I took a slow breath. "You poured cement over my garden." She didn't even blink. "We had no choice. You refused to comply after the first 2 warnings." Warnings. The only thing I got was a vague letter about landscaping uniformity. I had responded, requesting specific details, and never heard back. Now this. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "You destroyed my property. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Abigail waved a dismissive hand. "You can submit a request to plant something within HOA-approved guidelines, perhaps a nice row of shrubs." I wanted to laugh at her audacity. Instead, I pulled out my phone and snapped pictures of the mess. I wasn't going to argue with her. No, I had a better plan. One that would make her regret ever pulling this stunt. As I turned to walk back inside, Abigail called after me, voice laced with condescension. "It's best to just follow the rules next time, Zachary." I didn't answer. She had no idea what was coming. I didn't waste time. That same evening, I sat in my home office, sifting through every document I had on the HOA. I pulled up emails, letters, and the HOA's bylaws, highlighting every section related to landscaping and property rights. The more I read, the more my anger sharpened into something useful: an airtight legal case. Abigail Torrance thought she could steamroll me. She had no idea that I wasn't just some passive homeowner who would roll over and accept her tyranny. What she and her board had done wasn't just an overreach, it was illegal. Destroying private property under the flimsy excuse of compliance wasn't going to stand. The next morning, I made my way to the county courthouse and filed a lawsuit against the HOA for property destruction and trespassing. I attached every piece of evidence. I had pictures of my garden before, the slab of cement after, the vague letter they had sent, and my unanswered request for clarification. Then, I hired a process server to deliver the lawsuit directly to Abigail's doorstep. The wheels were in motion. 2 days later, I was in my driveway when I heard the unmistakable screech of tires. Abigail stormed toward me, her designer heels clicking furiously against the pavement. "This is outrageous," she snapped, waving the court documents in my face. "You're suing the HOA." I leaned against my truck, arms crossed. "That's what it says." "You're being ridiculous. This is a waste of time and money," I shrugged. "Then you shouldn't have destroyed my property." She scoffed, clutching the papers like they were personally insulting her. "We followed the rules." I tilted my head. "Did you?" "Because I went through the bylaws. Nowhere does it say you can demolish personal property without due process. And funny enough, I found a section about unauthorized alterations to private land." "The penalty is hefty." She opened her mouth, then shut it. For the first time, she looked uncertain. I pushed off the truck. "I'll see you in court." A week later, we were standing before a judge. Abigail had brought along the HOA's attorney, a man who looked like he charged by the breath. He tried to argue that I had violated HOA regulations, but I had come prepared. I handed over the documentation, including the bylaws, my unanswered request for clarification, and the photographic evidence of my garden before and after the destruction. "This wasn't enforcement," I told the judge. "This was destruction of property, and the HOA had no legal right to take such action." The judge examined the evidence carefully, then fixed Abigail with a stern look. "This is a clear case of unauthorized property damage. The HOA will cover the cost of restoring the plaintiff's garden and pay damages for the destruction." Abigail looked like she had swallowed a lemon, but I wasn't done. "Your Honor, there's also the matter of how this was funded." The HOA used community funds for this unauthorized action, which means homeowners were forced to pay for something illegal without their consent. The judge's frown deepened. "That is a serious accusation," I nodded. "I request a full audit of the HOA's finances to determine the extent of unauthorized spending." Abigail's attorney shifted uncomfortably. Abigail, on the other hand, had gone pale. The judge nodded. "Request granted." The audit uncovered something even worse than I expected. The board had been misusing HOA funds for years' lavish dinners, personal vacations, and even payments toward Abigail's luxury car collection. With the evidence exposed, the court ordered the HOA to repay every misused dollar. Abigail and her corrupt board members were personally liable for a significant portion of the repayment. When they couldn't cover it, the court approved asset seizures. That's how a month later, I found myself watching as Abigail's prized luxury vehicles were towed away, one by one. Her furious protests fell on deaf ears. As the last car disappeared down the street, my neighbor, an elderly woman who had lived in the community for decades, patted my shoulder. "You did good," she said. "It's about time someone stood up to them." I smiled. "This isn't over. We're voting in a new board next month." And this time, the HOA would work for the homeowners, not against them. Election day for the new HOA board arrived faster than expected. The neighborhood buzzed with anticipation, and for the first time in years, people actually cared about the outcome. The scandal surrounding Abigail and her corrupt board had ignited something in the residents, a hunger for change. The meeting was held in the community center, a modest but well-maintained hall that had mostly been used for HOA lectures and passive-aggressive rule enforcements. But tonight, it was packed with homeowners eager to cast their votes and put an end to the tyranny that had ruled for far too long. I arrived early, along with a few other residents who had formed an unofficial coalition to ensure the transition of power went smoothly. We weren't just replacing the board, we were making sure no one like Abigail ever got control again. As people filed in, I noticed Abigail sulking near the back, arms crossed, her lips pressed into a thin line. Her once pristine image had been shattered by the financial audit, the lawsuit, and the public humiliation of losing her luxury cars. She had tried to save face, but the community had turned against her. The process began with the usual formalities, but when it came time to nominate new board members, the energy in the room shifted. People were engaged, calling out names of trusted neighbors instead of the usual clique that had controlled everything for years. I was nominated, along with 4 others who had been vocal about the need for transparency. One by one, the residents cast their votes. The tension was thick, the air buzzing with an energy that had been missing from these meetings for far too long. When the final count was announced, it was a landslide. Abigail and her remaining allies were out, and our coalition had won by an overwhelming majority. As soon as the results were official, Abigail shot up from her chair, her voice sharp as she attempted to protest. She claimed the election was unfair, that the neighborhood was turning against her due to lies and misinformation. No one listened. People were done with her. The moment the meeting adjourned, she stormed out, her heels clicking angrily against the tile floor. I watched her go, knowing that this was the last time she'd ever hold power over this community. With the new board in place, we wasted no time getting to work. The first order of business was undoing the damage Abigail and her cronies had caused. We combed through every policy they had enacted, reversing the most egregious ones. We established transparency measures, ensuring that financial decisions were open to all homeowners. And most importantly, we put safeguards in place to prevent any future abuse of power. One of the most satisfying moments came when we reviewed the HOA's financial records in detail. The audit had uncovered plenty, but now we had full access. What we found was even worse than expected. Beyond the lavish personal spending, there were hidden fees and fines that had been quietly tacked onto homeowners' dues charges that had no legitimate basis. We immediately moved to reimburse the affected residents, using the remaining funds that hadn't been squandered. It wasn't just about fixing the financial mess, it was about restoring trust. As we cleaned house, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted. People who had once avoided HOA meetings now actively participated. The fear of arbitrary fines and power-hungry enforcement disappeared. The community became a place where people actually wanted to live, rather than one where they felt like prisoners in their own homes. One afternoon, as I worked on restoring my flower beds, the ones Abigail had so callously destroyed, a few neighbors stopped by. They offered to help, bringing plants and supplies. Together, we rebuilt what had been taken from me. It wasn't just about the flowers. It was about reclaiming our homes, our rights, and our community. And this time, we were never letting anyone take that away again. The transformation of the neighborhood was unlike anything I had seen before. It had taken years for Abigail and her cronies to instill fear and resentment, but in just a few weeks, we had undone much of their damage. Homeowners who had once felt powerless now had a voice, and the air of hostility that had hung over the community like a storm cloud was beginning to lift. One of the first major changes under the new HOA board was a full review of the association's financial policies. It turned out that Abigail had instituted a mountain of unnecessary fees, hidden penalties, and arbitrary fines that had drained homeowners of thousands over the years. Many of these charges had no legal standing, and in some cases, they were outright fraudulent. We held an emergency meeting to address the issue, and the turnout was unprecedented. Residents who had never bothered attending before flooded the community center, eager to see what would finally be done about the mess Abigail had left behind. The board presented the findings in painstaking detail, showing exactly how much money had been siphoned from the community under the guise of HOA improvements. The anger in the room was palpable. People were furious at how much they had been forced to pay for nothing. Abigail had used HOA funds to redecorate her own home, cover personal vacation expenses, and even pay for private security after her reputation started to crumble. But the most egregious revelation was how she had funneled money into a secret account, one she had tried to empty before the financial audit exposed her. That account had been frozen by the court, and those funds were now being used to reimburse homeowners for the fraudulent charges they had been forced to pay over the years. As the board outlined the plan for repaying residents, a man in the audience stood up. He was in his 60s, a retired firefighter who had lived in the neighborhood longer than most. His voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable edge of anger beneath it. "This is good," he said, "but what happens to her?" "She walks away free after what she's done." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. People wanted justice, not just financial restitution. I stepped forward, addressing the crowd. "Abigail isn't walking away from this. Civil lawsuits are already piling up against her, and with the financial fraud we've uncovered, there's now a criminal investigation. The district attorney's office is involved." A hush fell over the room as the weight of those words sank in. Abigail, who had once ruled the HOA like a dictator, was now facing the possibility of prison time. The meeting ended with a renewed sense of unity. For the first time in years, people weren't just attending out of obligation or fear. They were there because they cared, because they wanted to make sure the HOA could never be used as a tool for greed and control again. Over the next few weeks, changes swept through the neighborhood. The board eliminated unnecessary restrictions that had made life miserable for residents. Petty fines for things like mailbox colors and the height of lawn grass were abolished. Homeowners were given greater control over their properties, and the HOA's new budget was transparent and available for anyone to review. As we worked through these reforms, I kept an eye on Abigail. She had retreated into her house, avoiding public appearances, but word spread that she was scrambling to fight the legal battles closing in on her. She had already lost her luxury cars, and her personal accounts were under scrutiny. Rumors circulated that she was trying to sell her house before the court could seize it, but with her reputation in tatters, no buyer wanted to deal with her. Then, one afternoon, the inevitable happened. A convoy of black SUVs pulled up in front of Abigail's house. Federal agents stepped out, their presence sending a ripple of shock through the quiet street. A few neighbors peeked through their windows, others stepped outside, watching as the agents approached Abigail's front door. It wasn't long before Abigail emerged, her face pale, her usual arrogance replaced with something foreign fear. She argued, gestured wildly, but the agents remained unmoved. They handed her a document, and after a few tense moments, she was led to one of the waiting vehicles. As the convoy pulled away, the neighborhood was silent. Then, slowly, people started to emerge from their homes. A quiet sense of justice settled over us. Abigail, who had spent years lording over this community, had finally faced the consequences of her actions. A few days later, I received a letter in the mail. It was from Abigail's attorney, a last-ditch attempt at negotiation. They wanted to settle the civil lawsuit I had filed for the destruction of my flower beds. Apparently, with everything else crumbling around her, Abigail was desperate to avoid another courtroom fight. I took my time reviewing the offer before sending my response. I rejected it. She had stolen from this community, destroyed property that wasn't hers, and abused the power she was given. There wasn't a settlement large enough to erase that. As the weeks passed, life in the neighborhood returned to something resembling normalcy. My flower beds were fully restored, thanks to the help of neighbors who had become more than just acquaintances. The HOA, once a symbol of oppression, was now something that actually served the people living here. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset, I realized something. Abigail had thought she was invincible. She had built her little empire on manipulation, greed, and fear. But in the end, she had underestimated the very people she had tried to control, and that was her downfall. With Abigail out of the picture and the HOA restructured, the neighborhood finally had a sense of peace it hadn't known in years. The oppressive rules and arbitrary punishments were gone, and homeowners were reclaiming their spaces without fear of being targeted. Yards that had once been barren due to ridiculous landscaping restrictions were now vibrant with flowers, vegetable gardens, and personal touches that made each home feel unique. Despite the progress, there were still remnants of Abigail's reign that needed to be addressed. Her influence had left scars that couldn't be erased overnight. Some residents were still wary, hesitant to trust that the HOA had truly changed. Others were angry, demanding more accountability for those who had enabled Abigail's abuses. The new board had its work cut out for it, but we were determined to make things right. One of the biggest issues that still lingered was the cement slab where my flower beds had once been. While the court had ordered the HOA to cover the cost of restoring my garden, the actual process had been delayed due to the financial chaos left behind. Now that things had settled, it was time to finally remove the last physical reminder of Abigail's tyranny. Early one Saturday morning, I stood in my yard, surveying the cold, gray concrete that had suffocated my plants. A few neighbors had gathered, some offering to help, others just wanting to witness the final removal of Abigail's most blatant act of destruction. A local contractor, hired by the HOA, arrived with a jackhammer and a small crew. As they got to work, breaking apart the slab, there was a sense of catharsis in the air. Each strike of the jackhammer felt like another nail in the coffin of Abigail's legacy. Chunks of cement were hauled away, revealing the rich soil beneath. It would take time to restore my garden to its former glory, but this was the first step. One of my neighbors, an elderly man who had lived in the community long before Abigail took over, watched with a satisfied expression. He had been one of the first to support my fight against the HOA, and now, seeing the destruction undone, he nodded approvingly. With the cement gone, I wasted no time in replanting. The HOA covered the cost of new flowers, shrubs, and soil, per the court's ruling, and many of my neighbors contributed plants from their own gardens as a show of solidarity. Within days, my yard was alive with color again, a stark contrast to the gray slab that had once marred the space. As the neighborhood continued to rebuild, the HOA board implemented new policies to ensure that no one could ever abuse their power the way Abigail had. Financial transparency was now mandatory, with all expenses and budgets made public. Any changes to community regulations required a vote from homeowners, preventing a single person from unilaterally imposing rules. But perhaps the most significant change was the newfound sense of community. People who had once kept to themselves, afraid of drawing the HOA's ire, were now actively participating in neighborhood events. Block parties, gardening clubs, and even weekend cleanups became the norm. The fear that had once gripped the community was gone, replaced with a sense of ownership and pride. Despite all the improvements, there was still unfinished business Abigail's criminal case. While the civil lawsuits had financially ruined her, the criminal investigation had been slow-moving. The fraud she had committed was extensive, and the legal system was meticulously unraveling the full extent of her crimes. One evening, I received a call from a former board member who had turned whistleblower after realizing the depth of Abigail's corruption. He had been cooperating with investigators, providing documents and testimony that further implicated her. According to him, the prosecution was building a rock-solid case, and it was only a matter of time before Abigail faced trial. As the weeks passed, the final pieces of Abigail's downfall fell into place. The court found her guilty of multiple counts of financial fraud, embezzlement, and unauthorized destruction of private property. Her sentencing hearing was set, and many of the affected homeowners, myself included, planned to attend. The day of the sentencing, the courtroom was filled with familiar faces from the neighborhood. Abigail, once the untouchable queen of the HOA, now sat at the defense table, a shadow of her former self. Gone was the arrogance, the smug confidence. In its place was a woman who had lost everything: her wealth, her power, and the control she had once wielded over the community. The judge didn't mince words, laying out the full extent of her crimes. When the sentence was handed down, a collective sense of justice filled the room. Abigail would be spending several years behind bars, with additional financial penalties that ensured she would never regain the lifestyle she had once flaunted. As the bailiff led her away, she turned to look at the homeowners who had once feared her. There was no sympathy in their eyes, only relief that her reign of terror had finally ended. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The battle had been long, but it had been worth it. The neighborhood was free, stronger than ever, and finally in the hands of the people who truly cared about it. That evening, I sat on my porch, looking out at my restored garden. The marigolds, roses, and hydrangeas swayed gently in the breeze, a living testament to everything we had fought for. Justice had been served, and the community was finally home again. With Abigail gone and the HOA finally under responsible leadership, the neighborhood had entered a new era. The tension that had once defined daily life had dissipated, replaced with a sense of ease that had been missing for years. People were no longer afraid to make small improvements to their homes or gather for casual conversations in their yards without the looming fear of an arbitrary fine arriving in the mail. Despite the improvements, there was still work to be done. Abigail's mismanagement had left deep financial scars, and while homeowners had been reimbursed for many fraudulent charges, the HOA's budget was still in a fragile state. The new board had taken a cautious approach, ensuring that every dollar was accounted for and that no one could exploit the system again. One of the biggest challenges was repairing the damage Abigail had done to community spaces. The neighborhood park, once a vibrant gathering spot, had fallen into neglect under her leadership. Funds meant for its upkeep had been diverted into her personal expenses, leaving broken benches, overgrown grass, and a playground that looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. The board organized a restoration project, and nearly every homeowner pitched in. Some volunteered their time, others donated materials, and a few local businesses even contributed supplies. Over the course of several weekends, the park was transformed. Fresh paint covered the rusted playground equipment, new benches replaced the rotted ones, and a group of volunteers planted flowers along the walking paths. The final touch was a small community garden, a project spearheaded by several residents who wanted to bring something beautiful and useful to the space. Raised beds were built, filled with vegetables and herbs that anyone in the neighborhood could harvest. It was a stark contrast to the rigid control Abigail had exercised over private gardens, and the sight of families working together to plant and maintain the space was a reminder of how far the community had come. With the park restored, the next focus was ensuring that the HOA remained accountable. The board implemented a system where all major decisions required homeowner approval, preventing any future abuses of power. Financial reports were made public, posted online for anyone to review. These measures not only reassured residents, but also encouraged participation in the HOA meetings, which had once been seen as a waste of time. As the months passed, the neighborhood settled into a new rhythm. The hostility that had once defined interactions between residents had faded, replaced with a sense of camaraderie. People who had once avoided each other out of fear of being reported to the HOA were now forming friendships, bonding over shared experiences, and the work they had put into reclaiming their community. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a gathering formed in the newly restored park. It wasn't an official event, just neighbors coming together, enjoying the space they had fought to reclaim. Children played on the swings, couples walked along the paths, and small groups sat at picnic tables, sharing food and conversation. Among them was the elderly man who had been one of the first to support my fight against Abigail's corruption. He sat on one of the new benches, watching the scene with a satisfied expression. For the first time since I had moved into the neighborhood, it truly felt like home. The battle had been long, and at times exhausting, but standing there, surrounded by people who had once been strangers and were now friends, I knew it had been worth it. Justice had been served, the community had been restored, and the HOA was finally working for the people instead of against them. And that was exactly how it was going to stay.